before this morning, so I hope it doesn't happen again. As always, feel free to make questions during the lecture in the chat, or otherwise we will take questions at the end. James will follow that up. Yes, so far you know me well. I've been with you in some lectures previous time. My name is Paula Varela from Nofima in Norway, and the class of today will be a bit of big picture about sensory perception and the implications of sensory perception for consumer preferences. So we'll touch upon different topics. The learning points of today. We will go through the complexity of food choice. Particularly, we will look a bit into the food choice model by Koster and Moyet. We will talk about the individuality of food choices from a taste perception point of view. Also, dynamics of perception, and we will discuss a bit food structure and perception. Intrinsic and extrinsic product characteristics that drive choices, and also very briefly we will mention multisensory perception. So we will start with a question. What would you like to eat for dessert? At least myself, I haven't had lunch yet, and maybe when I have lunch after this lecture, normally I have a very light lunch, but if it was a bigger lunch, maybe I could think what to have for dessert. So in the slide you have there 3 pictures. One is very appetizing fruit brochettes. Then you have a raspberry sorbet and a very indulgent vanilla ice cream with a lot of sauce and chantilly. So which one would you choose for as dessert today? If I give my example, I like very much these 3 choices. It's maybe difficult to say which one I like the most. So then I would need to use other parameters or other things to help me my decision making. As today it's a weekday and it's a lunch, probably I would go for the fruit, because during the week one try to be a bit more conservative and restrict oneself in terms of calories or indulgent food that we eat and so on. Maybe if I'm more tempted, I go with the sorbet because it's middle way. But if it was a Friday evening dinner, most probably I would go for the indulgent ice cream. So, of course, sensory perception is what generally drives preferences, but choice goes much beyond the sensory experience, and we will focus on that today. So this is a very old quote, more from the marketing area. The consumer does not behave as he says, he does not say what he thinks, and he does not think what he feels. And what does it mean? Does it mean that consumers are lying to us when they are giving their thoughts? Probably not. It's mainly that sometimes there is a big gap between their attitudes or what they think they do and the reality. So if we look at these 2 examples, this is in the top picture. There is these 2 businessmen that they are discussing some work-related issues, and they are having a coffee. So probably the man here will go for an espresso or even a ristretto that will convey, apart from his preferences in this case, may convey his strengths in decision making in business. But maybe when he's outside with the family during a weekend, he will go for a latte or even a chai latte, very soft and mild. If he prefers one or the other, probably this person is a very different consumer in different situations or contexts. He's not lying or not faking his preferences, but food also might help convey different ideas and personality traits, and also will help us enjoy different situations. So one thinks, consumer preferences and if they are in different segments of preferences. Is this man in the very strong coffee segment preference or in the very mild and sweet coffee preference segment? He may change preference segments with the situation. If we see the lower image, we see a business lady, in this case, that is preparing dinner for their children and taking a phone call, business call at the same time. If we were to interview this lady, maybe we may ask, do you buy a lot of ready-to-eat meat or pre-prepared food takeaway? No, 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 I don't buy very much. I do most food from scratch, only ready meals on emergencies. But then maybe we are doing a home visit interview and we are looking at her freezer and we see that it's quite full of ready-to-eat meals. And then it's, yeah, but sometimes I come from the gym, I need to go to the gym and I come very, very late, so we use one of these, or I need to drive the children to different activities. So then was it that she was lying at the first place? No, she's not. That's her intention, but her behavior is completely different because what she perceives as an emergency may end up being 2, 3, or 4 times a week. And why is this happening? Because food choice is much more complex. Food choice is not only about the product and how the product tastes, but it's also about the context in which we eat this product, and also about the consumer and what is happening to that consumer in this moment of choice. As I said, this model of food choice, the model proposed by Koster and Moyet, I like it a lot because it's very very complete. I'm not thinking that you read all the bubbles in this context, in this model, but if we see a bit all the factors that contribute to food choices, we can see that, for example, here are the product parameters related to food choice. So we have intrinsic product characteristics and perception. So of course, sensory properties and composition of the foods will be very important for the choice. We need to like the food to choose it. But also extrinsic product characteristics may play a big role and expectations. For example, the claims, the name, the brand, some credence parameters like could be sustainability or health-related claims and so on. So these are product parameters that will drive our choices. But when you see all the other parts of the model, there are the consumer parameters related to food choice. So that will be, for example, biological and physiological factors. We don't eat the same or choose the same if we are trying to lose weight, or if we are heavy trainers, if we are if we are very hungry at the time of choosing, or if we just had a big meal the meal before. There are also psychological factors that are related to, for example, personality traits as neophobia or neophilia. So do we like trying new foods, or are we generally a bit wary of new foods and prefer foods that we know? Also things as emotions, stress. We choose very different foods if we are under stress. Some people under stress, they don't eat at all, and some people resource to very, for example, indulgent foods under stress. Also, we were talking about situational factors. We saw the example of this businessman having a coffee, but also think about yourselves. If you are in a business dinner, probably you won't choose the same as if you are in a dinner with family and friends and very close friends. Also, if you are, for example, in a first date, probably you won't choose a food that is difficult to eat, or spaghetti bolognese that you will have all the sauce over yourself. So you will go for something that is easier to eat and that allows you to focus on the person rather than on the food. And of course, very important socio-cultural factors like the culture and also economical situation, many things related to the socio-cultural factors that drive food choices. We know food culture is one of the main driver of food choices and preferences. So we think about the sensory is only that small bubble there, while there are many, many, many more factors. That doesn't mean that sensory is not important. Sensory is very important because it has to be right for people to keep buying and eating that food. But there are a number of other factors. So in a nutshell, we have all these factors that we mentioned, and we will go through different ones. So we will start with physiological factors and how they drive their choice. So first of all, we need to think that sensory experiences are individual. There are some authors that refer to the fact that we live in different sensory worlds, that we taste so different that we may be living in completely different worlds. So one of the things that is very well known in sensory science is prop status. So that is the insensitivity or sensitivity to aromatic thiourea compounds. These compounds are bitter, and for some people are very bitter. These people are called super tasters, while for other people they don't taste anything. If they taste a prop water solution, it will be like tasting water. And for those people, it will be we will call them non-tasters. And most of us are in the middle, so we can taste something but not extremely strong. And these substances help us to understand a bit more perception, and to understand that for some people perception is actually extreme. If we think about Caucasian population, because it's quite different for the different ethnicities, as an example for Caucasians, 30% are non-tasters, 25% will be super tasters, and 45% tasters. For many years, it was believed that this status of being extremely sensitive to these bitter compounds was related to the number of papilla in the tongue. So you see this picture on the right, where the number of papilla in the tongue was related to this perception. But this has been now at least argued, and there are some latest work by an Italian group of researchers that been able to test a huge number of subjects and measure not only prop status but other things like papilla density, responsiveness to taste stimuli, and even psychological traits. And if you see the plot down on the screen, you see that here in the x-axis we have the taster status. So here will be the non-tasters, the medium tasters, and the super tasters. And in the y-axis is the number of fungiform papilla. We see that there are some non-tasters that have very low number of papilla, but also there are some that have a high number of papilla. And the same for medium and super tasters. So there will be, there should be something more than the number of papilla. As I mentioned, this group also have investigated that this taster status, it was even related to psychological traits, and people that were more neophobic, so more reluctant to taste more and different foods, they will be usually related to more super tasters in this group, so they had very strong sensations. Sensory experiences are individual then. We will see more about that. If we look into fat perception, there has been a number of publications that say that fatty acids are detectable through taste receptors, and this taste perception is quite wide and quite variable in terms of sensitivity. There are people that are highly sensitive to fat taste, while others are not so sensitive. And that is determined by genetics, by sex, diet, and BMI. And that has very important implications regarding food choice that we will see in the next slide. Also, some publications have shown that fat perception could also be related to prop taster status. So this example of paper here have found that medium and super tasters, that are the two last groups in this plot, are more sensitive to fat content. So they are more able to discriminate. In this case, is an example of salad dressing with 10% fat and 40% fat. For non-tasters, they could not distinguish these two sauces by taste, but medium and super tasters did. So it seems that for at least for some people, the fact of being extremely sensitive to bitter taste could mean that they are also extremely sensitive to other tastes, like for example fat. It has been seen that people that were hyposensitive to fat, so very sensitive to very low sensitivity to fat, consumed significantly more energy, fat, and had greater BMI. So if we are not capable to discriminate between the taste of just low quantities of fat or high quantities of fat in food, it may mean that we eat more fat because we just don't recognize it. For example, these are just some examples on how this sensitivity influences what we eat and how much we eat. It also has been seen that prompt non-taster children, so those ones that will be insensitive to bitter, consume more vegetables, particularly bitter ones. So in this case, in the case of the fat, a low sensitivity could mean that they ate more unhealthy food. But in the case of bitterness sensitivity, being non-sensitive to bitter would mean that we eat more vegetables. So it could be positive in some way. This other example of paper has studied in the individual responsiveness to astringency, and it has been seen that sensitivity towards astringency also influences acceptability of astringent foods like tea, coffee, and chocolate, but also vegetables. So for people that are highly sensitive to bitterness and astringency, they will maybe drink less coffee, tea, etc., but also eat less vegetables. So to perceive or not to perceive, that is the question, depending on what people perceive or do not perceive in a product. Other flavors also could be diminished or enhanced, and in turn it will influence preferences and diet. As we saw, the fact that we taste more or less fat or bitter will make that we consume less or more, for example, vegetables or fatty food. But also, if we perceive a food as more bitter, then the taste will be in a way unbalanced. So if we perceive more bitterness, we will perceive less sweet, and then we will more surely add more sugar to foods, or add sugar to coffee, for example. On the other hand, if we have low sensitivity to bitterness, it can be that also the taste we perceive is quite unbalanced. So when one is developing products, one need to think that we are not developing product for one consumer. We are developing products for a completely wide variety of preferences, but also taste sensitivities. So now we will talk a bit about intrinsic product characteristics. Starting again with a question, is it the flavor or is it the texture? If we first, before reading what's on the slide, we look at these three pictures down there, there is an example of a raspberry juice. We have also a raspberry mousse and a raspberry sorbet. So this is when one think about the formulations could be almost identical or very slight differences, because one could add a little bit of hydrocolloids that don't add taste or don't add calories, and make a mousse coming from a juice, because we add some gel emulsifiers and so on. And we can do the same and then freeze it, and we have a raspberry sorbet. So almost with the same composition. However, they will taste completely different. It doesn't taste the same if we drink a juice that if we eat a mousse almost with the same composition, because we have so much air in a mousse that the flavor release will be much slower. While in a juice, it will come to our taste buds very quickly. And in the case of the sorbet, we will have a lot of air inside, but we also have very cold temperature, meaning that will make that we perceive also the flavor much less because of the temperature. Then if you think about in terms of food formulation, we will need to add probably much more sugar to the mousse and even more to the ice cream, so it is perceived equally sweet than in a juice. So that means that food structure is a determinant of the sensory perception. It's not only what we put in terms of macronutrients that will give the sensory perception, but also the structure. So viscosity will also affect the release of tastants in the mouth, many times hindering aroma-taste interactions. And as in the example, hydrocolloids can change completely the matrix structure of the product, and also this water tastant availability, as I was saying, in the mousse structure or in the ice cream structure, the tastants take much more time to reach the tongue and to reach the taste buds. Also, fat content will influence the sensory profile through their own taste. So, for example, if this last strawberry sorbet, we put a bit of cream, it will enhance and give taste on the fatty side. It will also give mouth feeling, but it will change the solubility of the water-soluble compounds, also change the melting point and emulsifying. So this change in structure will go much further than only adding fat taste. They will add many more characteristics. And that is also what we need to think when we are formulating products. Is not only taste we are adding, but we are changing the structure, changing solubility, changing aroma taste interactions, changing mouth feel, melting point, etc. And going a bit further, so we were talking about the product structure. This product structure will also influence how we perceive not only the intensity of flavors, but if we also think that sensory perception is dynamic, the food will change in our mouth while we eat. So there are many foods where we think about differently at the different points in the consumption. So, for example, there is a first impression. If we think about the wine, we usually think about, okay, we have an impact at the beginning and then a development of the flavor and an after taste. But when we think about products with a texture, this could be either even more important. So we have texture changes in mouth, we have flavor release, we have mouth coating. Also, we need to chew until we swallow. And this is determined if we look into the image that is at the left in the screen. This is kind of the trip that follows during one bite. So we take a bite. If it's solid, the food, first of all, we need to comminute, so make these particles smaller to being able to process them in mouth. So this has a consequence on the sensory perception. The sensory perception will focus a lot on the texture on this part of the oral processing. We will focus on the hardness, on the crunchiness, for example. So we will be more really related to these fracture mechanics and muscles. Then the particles will be smaller, and in mouth we start to release saliva to being able to form this bolus, this mass that I will be able to swallow. So then that also again has implications to the sensory perception. There will be an interaction of the particles with the saliva, and then it will be a release of the tastants because they solubilize in the saliva and reach the palate and the taste buds. So then here the perception still will be, of course, driven by texture, but flavor will play a very important role when we have all this hydration of the food in the mouth. And at the end of the mastication, before we swallow, we are programmed, our physiological system is programmed that when we swallow, the texture of this bolus should be very concrete. We don't have a very varied texture of foods that we can swallow, so we need to work on them until we can swallow them physically, something we do unconsciously, but that happens in the mouth. So then our perception will be also very much related to the textural rheological properties of these bolus, and stickiness, for example, cohesiveness, adhesivity will be very important parameters. So many times when we think about sensory, we think about, okay, how sweet it is, or how hard it is, or how sticky it is. But when we think about the real experience, all these things are changing all the time in the mouth. So sensory perception is really dynamic, and even it can change from bite to bite. For example, when we are eating chocolate, the first bite, we have really strong sensations related to the taste, but then we start to saturate our taste buds, and then the further bites will be not as intense in terms of taste, for example. So these temporal aspects of perceptions are quite important when determining consumer preferences, because there could be many attributes that are more or less important for a product at each point in time. And we can think about, for example, assessing this trip of the product in our mouth. For example, this is for biscuits, that first it was hard, then crisp, then gritty, then pasty, and then left fat mouthfeel in the mouth. And that could be important when we are changing product formulation and we are, for example, trying to make a biscuit that is low in fat. Then maybe we lose part of the pastiness or the fat mouthfeel because we don't have it anymore in the temporal perception. So a more concrete example, this is two cheeses. Jarlsberg type of cheeses are very typical cheeses in Norway, but this like a semi hard or medium hard cheese that we can eat with the bread, for example. And if you see here, you don't need to read, we also see in Norwegian the attributes, but you can see that the two sensory profiles are very similar, only a small difference here in gumminess, but they seem very, very similar. However, these two cheeses are very different sensorially. One is the market leader and the other one is a very far competitor. And when one looks at the temporal sensory profile, then one realizes they are really different because the complexity of the sensory temporal experience is very different. So the first one here is the one that I said that is the leader in the market. You see that many more things are happening in mouth at the same time, while this other one is basically gummy, sweet and sticky in the mouth. While in the first case, we have many more sensations that are happening all the time in mouth. And this complexity and it's more interesting for the consumer, might be the driver of the preferences rather than the actual intensities of the sensory attributes. This temporal perception, it's important for preferences, but it can also be very important for other things like food intake. This paper that I'm presenting as an example, it's based on the work of one of my master's students and one of my PhD students, that they worked on understanding the role of dynamic texture perception in consumers' expectations of satiety and satiation. So how much satiating we find food will determine how much we eat of it. And of course, it has consequences for health, because if it's very satiating, we will eat less of it and can help us fight, for example, overeating. However, if we are looking, for example, to elderly people that we want them to have more calories, then we would like to have food that is less satiating, so they eat more of it, or for a person with undernutrition. So in this example, we worked with breads that had exactly the same composition, and we used different technologies in the baking, like different raising conditions and so on, to get breads that had different textures. One were more compact, others were more fluffy. And here is the expected satiety as rated by consumers. And we see that one of the breads was much less satiating than the other three breads. And what were the characteristics of this bread? So these differences in satiation were really driven by the temporal or dynamic texture perception in mouth. The breads that were more satiating were typically quite doughy and sticky, while during mastication, while this bread that was less satiating was more dry, crumbly in texture. And this, you can see that was exactly the same components in the bread, the same composition. So only playing with the texture perception, and particularly with the dynamic texture perception, how we perceive texture in mind, we can really change preferences and expectations. So when to perceive or when not to perceive, that is also an important question. These differences in dynamic perception can be utilized in product development, for example, to get more satiating products to fight obesity, or less satiating products to make people eat more, for example, for elderly or people in risk of undernutrition. If we are developing products that we want, for example, undernourished children to eat, we would like them to be the less satiating as possible, so they can have the same amount of calories, but they can have more calories in a portion. Now I want to mention multisensory perception. So when we have been talking about flavor and taste, also we mentioned a bit odor and texture, but how the different perceptions interact with each other. Because when we perceive a product, we perceive everything of the product, not just the taste or just the texture. So then we can talk about multisensory perception and the modulatory effect of, for example, in the slide you have there, visual cues on flavor perception. This is an example from a publication where they had different drinks that had different tastes, for example, lime, strawberry, orange, and flavorless. What they did is they colored this drink with different colors, so like green, standard, double green, orange, red, colorless, and they asked people to taste and say which flavor the drink was. And if we look at the lime, for example, when the lime beverage was colored orange, it was recognized only by 25% of the interviewed consumers. So then we see that there is an interaction. It's very, very typical that if we eat, for example, at some drops like sweet drops, we many times cannot recognize the flavor. And many times it is because of the color is not in line with the flavor we expect. A bit more on that example, in this paper, they presented to consumers in the UK and Taiwan with these 6 drinks you see on screen that were different colors: brown, blue, yellow, orange, and so on. And they asked consumers to say which flavor they expected this drink to be. If we see for the British participants, when they were presented with the brown beverage, they mostly say it was cola, some cherry or blackcurrant. But for Taiwanese participants, no one mentioned cola, and they mentioned rather grape, mulberry, or cranberry. Again, if we look, for example, at the example of the orange one, for British participants, they mentioned all of them orange flavor, while for Taiwanese, they mentioned cranberry, strawberry, and apple. And what are the difference? Of course, the difference are cultural. The difference is the exposure they have. If, for example, in Taiwan at that time, cola was not a drink that was very much drunk by Taiwanese people, then they won't come up with that. Or if when they drink a beverage that is orange, is never orange juice because of the cultural differences, then the expectations generated will be very different. So different colors potentially carry different semantic meanings depending on a person's previous experiences with a specific color flavor co-occurrences. And if this bring this concept further, then okay, we have a color and flavor that in our minds go together. So we have predefined expectations. And the same can happen, for example, with odor and flavor. And in this example, we look into this cross-modal, this is called cross-modal interactions, that we perceive something with one sense and what we perceive with the other could interact. So in the slide you have, it's an example of strawberry yogurt, or the strawberry flavor. And usually, if we see in picture A, when we have perceive odor of strawberry, so the part that tells us it's strawberry is really the aroma, is usually sweet. So for us, strawberries are sweet. So then there is this synthesis of strawberry odor with sweet taste that occurs in our mind to create this strawberry flavor. So for us, strawberry flavor is this link of sweetness and another profile. So strawberry flavor is sweet for us. And many times you can realize that we many times talk about a sweet smell, while smells are not sweet at all, because sweetness is a taste. So this is really because in our brain this is encoded. Some smells are sweet for us because when we taste this food, then it's sweet. So then there is a synthesis. We are not analyzing them separately, but synthesizing the information. And that can be used in product development and in different aspects of product design. How can we use it? We can see what happens here. In this plot here, we have a solution of 5% sucrose, where consumers were asked to rate the sweetness level. In the first bar here, this 5% sucrose solution had some strawberry odor, and in this second one, strawberry odor was enhanced, and consumers rated the sweetness of the solution much higher, meaning that they perceived it sweeter, not because it had more sugar, it was the same level of sugar, but because it has more strawberry odor. And that can be used in product development. If we want to reduce, for example, the sugar content of some food, we can add more aroma that is congruent with sweetness. For example, it can be strawberry, the same happens with vanilla, with caramel. Those aromas are all linked to sweetness perception. There are some literature also, for example, we can use that with salty perception with some spices. So we can reduce salt content by adding spices that we perceive as a synthesis with salt perception. So that's these multisensory or cross-modal interactions could be used in our favor when we want to generate healthier products. So to taste more or not to taste more, this is also a very good question. This multisensory integration could be potentially utilized to formulate products with low salt or sugar. So now I think I want to talk about this intrinsic product characteristics and extrinsic product characteristics and how they play together. So I will show you this example on ham, dry cured ham in Norway. I want to see also how many slides I have. Yes, I don't want to be late. So this example of ham was run in Norway and in Italy, and they tried to study the effects of evoked milk context on consumer responses to intrinsic and extrinsic product attributes. So when we talk about extrinsic is, for example, how we market the product. So if we have some claims on it about the origin, about yeah, it could be different claims. So in this case, they evaluated the same hams, and they asked consumers, imagine a situation where you eat dry cured ham in a meal with several small dishes like finger food or tapas, and they asked how much do you like or dislike this ham. They also had a situation that instead of this finger food or tapas, they had a cooked meal that is quite typical of Norwegian culture. And then they used the same samples that they rated in one or other context of eating. Another thing they did is to taste the same hams presented with the Norwegian flag or the Spanish flag, and they combined these things. So it presented the Norwegian ham for a cooked meal or for a tapas meal, and the same with the Spanish. What they saw is there was an effect of the meal and also an effect on the communications. Consumers had different expectations depending the same products, because they were tasting the same products when they were communicated as Spanish or Norwegian, or they were communicated to use in a tapas meal or to use in a traditional meal. So this how we communicate the product. It can influence how we perceive it. So one thing that they also saw that I forgot to say, it was a bit different if it was a traditional meal or if it was a new meal like the tapas one. And when they were going to choose, it was the different than if they only assess liking. So for example, for a traditional meal, the difference was bigger. So how we claim the product could influence when consumers choose them or not choose them for a specific situation. So this unpack communication and product positioning can drive perception and can drive acceptance, but drivers can work differently in different products. So we don't have time to go into many details on this, but also, like for example, health claims or sustainability claims can have very much influence on choice. Just a quick example, generally speaking, consumers, when they see that a product is healthier, like for example, reducing fat, reducing sugar, high in fiber, they have always expectations that it will taste less good than a one that has not been modified. And there has been experiments when they give this exactly the same product with health claims and without health claims, and consumers would like less the one with health claims. So we have a lot of expectations based on the communication of the product. So what shall we communicate or not in the pack is very important decision also with regards to consumer liking and preferences. So then a bit on psychological factors. Emotional aspects of eating are very important in eating behavior. We mentioned a bit of things in the beginning on the class, how we don't choose or eat the same if we are under stressed. Also, if we are depressed, some people tend to indulge themselves more if they are low in mood. And there is more and more research into the emotional side, if food can be used to create emotions or to provoke emotions. So there is many papers looking into how we can create emotions with food, because of course food industry, they have very good products, and then the competition could be in other things like this one. So creating food to create positive emotions can be very good, but we shouldn't forget other part of this relation of food and mood to emotions and to food intake. And that is that there has been also papers that show that emotion, the relation to food also has an addictive aspect to it, and that foods that are highly provoking emotions of people, like, for example, very indulgent foods, chocolate, also alcohol, they can be linked to addiction. So we may be triggering more problems related to eating behavior and adding to, for example, issues of obesity. So also we need to be careful to how we integrate this emotional part with food preferences and food choice. Last but not least, our perception of food draws on an integration of all the senses. We already talked a bit about this multisensory experience and how all the senses are really communicated. But also they are physical, so this is more on the perception and exposure, but also on the physiological part. So for example, smell and taste are linked neurological in a way that no other human senses are. So not only they are linked perceptually, but also physiological. We know that sound can affect texture perception, so there are some foods that, for example, crispy foods is very important, the auditory part of them. So when we eat something crispy, we are expecting to hear the sound. So hearing and touching are interlinked in this case. We saw examples how color can affect taste perception. And we have neurons that respond specifically to the texture of fat in the mouth. So we were talking about sensitivity, and sensitivity is very complex when we have specific neurons for the detection of fat, for example. We also saw that mentioned something that texture and flavor are interlinked. These examples we saw with flavor and odor, we have similar examples with texture. So when we are eating, for example, a yogurt, a vanilla yogurt, the thicker it is, we may perceive more vanilla and vice versa. And it's also related to the sweetness perception. So all these interlinks that are on sometimes at perception level, other at physiological level, we can use them when designing food products. So what would you like to eat for dessert? We have seen in the class that complex problems require multidimensional approaches because there is no such thing as a simple sensory experience. It's not only about how much we like or not only about how sweet it is. There are many other things that play a role in food choice that are related to sensory perception. So this was all I wanted to tell you today, and we still have a few minutes for questions. So I will stop sharing my screen, and we see if there are some questions in the chat. Yes, I see that there are some comments. Yeah, thanks for the condolences. And public health implications and the market success implication. Yes, and as we were saying at the end of it, we need to sometimes be careful because, of course, when we work in the industry, we want to make our product the best possible. But as sensory researchers, we also have a social responsibility, and we need to think about social issues like health and sustainability when we are designing our products. And James, you were saying about this example of the discriminant attributes become clearly via the temporal perceptual analysis. Yes, definitely. So for example, in this case of the Jarlsberg cheese, it was quite clear that there was almost no difference when you only measured intensity, but they were very different in the perceptual aspects. But in the example I gave with the bread, it was also like that. For example, juiciness, if I remember well, juiciness, if you only measure the intensity, there was no significant difference between among the four samples. However, when you looked into juiciness from a temporal perspective, the juiciness in the more satiated samples came earlier, while the samples that were less satiating, they were drier, so the juiciness was perceived more at the end of the mastication. Yes, Riete is saying thank you for the interesting presentation. It's not always easy to separate noise from the effects that we plan to investigate. Yes, because there are many, many parameters that may drive, for example, preferences. And Miriam, just like prop status for taste, is there a way to measure other traits like texture? Well, this is a very interesting but very complex question. Yes, there are many different things. And in fact, in texture, it's very early, the study of sensitivity. Taste, it has been studied for years. Texture, just right now, we are starting to look into tactile sensitivity in mouth. So there are some studies to see, for example, what is the minimum size, particle size we recognize with the tongue as a measurement of texture sensitivity. So there are people that are extremely sensitive to differences in particle size, while others are less different. So this is a way of measuring the sensitivity. But there is also seen that there are enormous individual differences on what we call, or what is called in literature, the preferred eating behavior process. So for example, there are some of us that we are very, it is called as cruncher. We like to crunch into food, and then we usually tend to prefer crunchy, crispy, hard textures, while other people like more to suck into food. So for example, it's these people that would have a sweet for hours in their mouth, while others will chew it and swallow it. And then these people that like more the sucking will prefer more textures that are creamier and softer and so on. So it's also interesting to see that we are different in how we handle the food in mouth, and that create differences in preference and also in intake. So one of my previous PhD students, Quang from Vietnam, his thesis focused on how people perceive differently texture, and that determines how much they eat. And that's also very interesting to see. Yes, more questions? You can put on the microphone if you also want to ask something else. No, okay. So then I will take the chance to stop the recording that has worked really well today.